Welcome to the Snowbirds Expat Radio Podcast, powered by the Snowbird US Day Tracker app. I'm your host, Gerry Scott, and my goal is to give you answers to your cross-border questions, to ease the stress of a cross-border move or extended trip, and to keep you up to date on all you need to know with cross-border rules and regulations. Now let's get on with the show. Welcome back to another episode of the Snowbirds Expat Radio Podcast, the show where we help Canadians and Americans navigate the financial, tax, lifestyle realities of living life across the border. Well, today we have Karlene with us, and she's going to go into more details. There's a lot of things happening. I see you've got a brand new brand, and you've got your master's in taxation. So we're proud of you. So tell us a little bit more what you've been up to the last little while here.
Thanks a lot, Gerry. So it's certainly a pleasure to be on. It's always nice to see you. And last year we did a rebrand. So we previously went under the name Cross Border Financial, but we rebranded to Brij Professional Corporation. And as you can see, the new logo is behind you there. And recently as well, I completed my master's in taxation with Golden Gate University. So I'm really armed and equipped heading into another tax season.
Well, finding out as well, we were talking about not only do we manage these designations and the education that we're committed to making sure we're the best at what we do, but you also have two daughters. You've got a 14-year-old, and you also have one of your daughters in university. So mom is busy.
Actually, a daughter and
daughter
a
and son, I'm sorry.
But yes. One in university and just one at home now. So yes, I am quite busy.
Okay, are they going to follow mom into taxation, the taxation world?
Well, I don't think my son will. He has a little bit of a macro brain. He's a little bit more mathematical. My daughter may, but I think she's more inclined to be a lawyer. She's been challenging me somewhat. So we'll see.
Oh, that's good. Well, we know that we were also discussing that with the growth of the space in the cross-border, finding good people is very, very difficult. So if there's anything I can do to persuade your kids to go into mom's field so that mom can have a little bit of time off, because I know you work pretty hard and we appreciate what you do for our clients. Well,
Thank
today's episode is really discussing principal residences. And there's a lot of things that I didn't know on how these principal residences can be set up. So the first question I have for you, explain to me the principal residence rule as it pertains to the U.S. side and in Canada.
Gerry, in answering that question, I think first of all, we need to consider what qualifies as a principal residence, right? And in very simple terms, it's the home that you live in. But with all things tax, the devil is often in the details. And so if we were to first take the Canadian end, what qualifies as a principal residence is normally a home that you ordinarily inhabit. The rules are a little bit more relaxed than we see on the US end. And so what that means is you can actually have a cottage in Muskoka that you live in for 2 months of the year. And that home could actually qualify as your principal residence if you ordinarily inhabit it. So we don't have bright lines regarding the number of days that the home needs to be occupied. And we also have some flexibility in terms of who can occupy the home. So the home can be occupied by the taxpayer's spouse, or even a child of the taxpayer. So my son could actually be away at university in a home that I own, and I would be able to claim a principal residence exemption on that home if he ordinarily occupies it. Now, let's turn to the US end. The US rules are typically a little bit more prescriptive, shall we say. And on the US end, we will qualify for a principal residence exemption if at least 2 of the 5 years preceding the year that we've sold a home, that we've both owned the home and used the home. And the requirements in terms of who needs to do that is a little bit more rigid than what we're seeing in Canada. So typically we're dealing with the spouse. The taxpayer must own the house, and the spouse doesn't have to own it, but both can use it as well.
I was being a little silly when I said I wasn't familiar with the principal principal rules, but and I'm going to go off a little off script here. We're just going to have a great conversation because there are some things that I think are very confusing. So we have this principal residence in Canada. And then I decide I'm going to marry an American. I hope my wife isn't watching this episode. I have nothing planned, Melissa. But if I do marry an American and all of a sudden that American comes up to Canada and they come on title of my home, and this is a U.S. taxpayer, how does that change things? Does that on the Canadian side, it would be, I'm going to let you describe how that scenario plays out.
Yeah, so if you marry an American and that person comes on to the title, if they're also living in Canada, then they're going to be subject to taxes in two jurisdictions, right? So we need to be thinking about things from the Canadian perspective and the US perspective. So from the Canadian perspective, there probably won't be too much of an issue because the rules are a little bit more relaxed. You can ordinarily inhabit the home. The other thing with the Canadian rules, Gerry, is that there's no cap in terms of how much gain can be exempted from capital gains claims when you actually sell the property. On the flip side, the US rules are a little bit more restrictive. And so if we only have one US filer, the gain that we're able to exclude becomes capped at $250,000 unless you're filing a joint return. So in your scenario, you actually mentioned that one taxpayer is Canadian and one is not. And so it depends on whether the non-American taxpayer is actually choosing to file a return as an American. And many who actually fall into that bucket where one spouse isn't American actually prefer not to file a US return. So if you had a gain on the property and let's say that gain was $500,000 and only one taxpayer was filing a U.S. return, well, the gain that you could exclude on that U.S. return would be limited to $250,000. Not a pleasant experience.
So is the correct thing, and we get asked this all the time, and sometimes, in this cross-border space, we only get brought in after the damage has been done. But let's say that they were mature enough and they were seeking this information. Is it highly recommended that the U.S. person should not be on the principal residence on the Canadian side?
Gerry, that is an interesting question. And I think it could be helpful, right? Because, we have to think about estate requirements, not just current taxation requirements, but also estate tax implications as well. The other thing we want to think about is the U.S. expatriation rules. So the way those rules work is that if you have a net worth above a certain amount that's in your name, you could actually be subject to expatriation tax should you decide to leave the United States in the future. So for the American taxpayer, if they're not on title, they don't have any ownership to that property, down the road, it could actually benefit them, if they decide to actually exit the U.S. taxation system.
Okay, here's something else. Like I say, I'm totally going off script now, so I hope I don't mess it up for you, Karlene here. But is it possible if a Canadian is renting up here in Canada and they own a residence down in the States, there's Snowbird, can they designate that U.S. place their principal residence on the other side of the border?
They can. If they're residents in Canada, they're allowed to claim a principal residence exemption, and there isn't a requirement for the home to be based in Canada. So if the rules are met, if they ordinarily inhabit the home, they may be able to claim that exemption. But, when we have dual tax filing requirements, Gerry, I think one of the things that we need to consider is the tax impacts on both sides and how the foreign tax credits actually work out, if there are any. So, we tend to take a combination approach. We don't just look at just one side. We have to consider the overall tax burden and the tax impact there.
So let's say, for example, they do declare it as their principal residence. They follow all the rules, the exemption rules, that they live in there for a certain, 2 of the last 5 years or whatever the case is. Now they sell that home and they've got a $500,000 capital gains on that home. How are they taxed if they're not filing? Because you would have a TIN number when you would sell it. What tax implications do they have on the U.S. side? And would there be none on the Canadian side?
Well, actually, Gerry, let me just clarify the first question. They will qualify for the exemption in Canada. But as a non-resident of the US, if they were to sell that property, they would actually be filing a return as a non-resident, and those rules would not apply. So when you sell property in the United States and you are a non-resident, special rules actually apply. And Canada has similar rules as well for non-residents. The way those rules work is that there are some flat withholding requirements that would apply based on the gross amount of the proceeds that are actually realized from the property. And so you could actually have a situation where you have, a gain that's $100,000, but under the FERPTA guidelines, you could have a much larger withholding that needs to go to the IRS within a few days following the sale of the property. Now, as well, if you're a non-resident of the US, you may not have a social security number. So if you're filing a tax return for the first time, that individual would also need to apply for a US individual tax identification number. And then as well, there's certain forms that need to be completed when we're dealing with withholdings, such as the form 8288 or 8288A. That is actually sent to the IRS to report the withholdings, and would then also be attached to the filings, which would be the 1040 NR at the end of the year.
How common is it that you've seen Canadians declare their principal residence in the United States as snowbirds? Is it common?
I would say not. And the reason is that you can only designate one home as a principal residence for each tax year. And strategically speaking, that makes sense that if you're going to designate a home, you want to designate the home that has the biggest gain, right? And the typical jurisdictions we're seeing these snowbirds in, places like Florida and Arizona, the gains on those properties tend not to outrise or exceed the gains that you have in Canada. And so from a strategic standpoint, we don't see individuals claiming exemptions on those homes. They're going to claim the exemption on the home that has the bigger gain because, again, you can only claim one exemption each tax year.
When I came across this, I mean, I was a little surprised that someone would declare a U.S. Property as their principal residence. But the direction came from their accountant, and I think it kind of backed him into a corner because now they're thinking, well, we want to buy a house in Canada and we want to take advantage of some of these plans. Maybe the housing, there's the first-time homeowners plan, but then there was another plan out there as well, the HOP plan, which it really backed them in the corner, which they weren't able to do it. So I was kind of surprised, and you and I talked about this. There's a lot of people out there in the cross-border space that aren't that good.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There are provisions available, but we don't necessarily utilize them if they're not in the best interest of the taxpayer. So if we have the option to do it, we don't only think short term in terms of the current year, we have to think long term as well. We have to think, what other property does the taxpayer own and what could the tax picture look like 5 or 10 years down the road?
Because really the U.S. government, because you're a Canadian, the U.S. rules don't apply, and there's nothing to apply against on the U.S. tax return. You might be able to be some savings on the Canadian side, but isn't that the case? The Americans don't really. You're a Canadian and you're declaring this as a principal residence, but we're not using the U.S. rules 2 of the last 5 years, are we? Is that?
Oh no, we're not. We're not. We're using the ordinarily inhabited
Of the
rule.
Canadian side.
Yes.
So the
Yes.
IRS doesn't care. They're going to withhold their taxes and sorry, Paul.
Oh, absolutely. So, when we have 2 returns to file, when we're filing one, we have to think about the tax rules that govern that tax return, which could be quite different from those that govern another return, right? So when we're doing a US return, we're really reflecting on the IRS rules there and how that would actually be applicable to the taxpayer situation.
Okay, so now that we've got this all cleaned up. A Canadian owns a property in the United States. They're Canadian taxpayers. This is their winter home, their snowbird nest. They sell it. very, very
Mm-hmm.
simple for you to do the tax returns. There's a TIN number where they're going to withhold taxes,
Yeah,
and you take care of all that for them. And then the capital gains is reported on the Canadian side, but foreign tax credits will offset a double taxation.
absolutely. It's possible for that to happen. Now, it depends, right, Jerry? So there are different taxation rules on the US end and the Canadian end. So if there is a gain, okay, and it depends on whether, let's say, depreciation was claimed or not. We often see depreciation claimed in the US and then sometimes not on the Canadian return. So it's actually possible to have a loss on one end and a gain on the other end. But absolutely, to the extent there are taxes paid in the United States, we would be eligible to claim those credits in Canada if they're subject to worldwide taxation there.
Okay, now that we've gotten past the October 15th deadline, we're now going into a new taxation year. Are there changes coming that people should be aware of?
So, Jerry, that's an interesting question. This year, the big bill that we saw come into place in the US was the One Big Beautiful Tax Bill. And I think that bill really we see pretty much of the same with respect to the application of the rules to a principal residence and the exemptions that would be applicable. So, no big changes, I would say, on the US end. On the Canadian end, we are seeing some changes that will come into effect January 1, 2026, with respect to the inclusion rate for capital gains. Now, in most instances, you can actually exclude the gain on the sale of your principal residence, but to the extent you can't exclude some or all of the gain, this rule could be applicable to you. So historically speaking, we've been able to exclude or only include rather 50% of the gain on the sale of a capital item on a Canadian return. However, effective January 1, 2026, the inclusion rate is actually going up a little bit higher. So it's now 2/3 to the extent the gain exceeds $250,000. So the provisions remain the same to the extent you're eligible to exclude the entire gain. But in some instances, it could be that you didn't qualify for the exemption for certain years and a gain could apply. So we need to be factoring in whether or not the gain is above $250,000 because we're going to see an increase in tax liabilities with respect to capital gains in 2026.
You know, the reason why we're really talking about this is because we're hearing so many, Canadians are boycotting America and Canadians want to sell their places. I know what we read in the paper isn't always true, but are you experiencing a lot of people selling homes in the United States right now?
I think that's the word on the street. And now that we're in the fall, this is when we would sort of begin to see indications of that with individuals coming in for support with respect to the properties that they have disposed of. But yes, that was certainly the word on the street, right? Not just the political climate in the US, but also as well, things like insurance rates had gone up, Jerry. The exchange rates, it was just really unfavorable for Canadians. And so there are a number of factors that resulted in a lot of snowbirds actually selling their properties in 2025. And so the view is that when we get to the 2026 tax season, it would probably be a bumper year for reporting properties that have been disposed of in the US for
You know, as
Canadians.
much as we talk about insurance rates and the exchange rate is always going to be favorable or unfavorable as a Canadian buying US dollars. But we're also hearing a lot of folks that are calling in regarding the Snowbird US Day Tracker app, and the questions they're asking, the generation below them that these kids are going to inherit these dollars, they don't want to go down to the States. They don't want to be isolated to one place. They want to go to Disney World over in France or whatever, or go on cruises. So I think there's that big play that maybe that next generation just wants the money and they don't want the headache. How?
Exactly. An easier life, right, Jerry?
Yeah, I think so. And mom and dad love the idea of nest. I know we ourselves, Melissa and I, love to go to Maui, and I don't think the kids would ever isolate themselves just going to one place. They've been to Croatia and Italy and Europe and all these other places. So they're getting a lot more experience out of mom and dad just, enjoying that, the people there, we have it's almost like a double light. But, we are seeing in Maui with the fires that the insurance costs have gone up. The property taxes have skyrocketed. So I can get that. It's a lot more expensive. But anything else you can anticipate that we know we're going to be busy with Canadians coming home or boycotting the United States, whatever you want to call this, bringing their wealth back. Is there anything else that you're seeing out there in your practice that's really creating a lot more work these days for yourself?
Well, or clients tend to fall into certain buckets, Gerry. We just spoke about those who actually own properties in the US or live on one side and own properties on the other. Another big type of or set of clients that we tend to get would be young Canadians actually moving to the US for job opportunities. Okay, so we do see that as well. And then we see Americans or former Canadians who moved to the US are now retiring and actually coming back to Canada. So we are seeing that movement as well. And then, of course, we always have Americans that live in Canada who have to file regardless of where they live. So that's always one that we're dealing with.
Well, I know that you're going to be on the podcast in the next 5 weeks. I believe we're going to do another episode with Karlene here. But it's a very interesting question. When you're finding these Canadians that are coming home, what is the number one motivation for them to come home? You're finding?
I think they want a more relaxed environment to be in, depending on where they've been. Let's say they're in the Northeast USA, in New York or California. The pace is a lot faster. And I think many of them prefer the healthcare system that we may have in Canada, right? Because if you're in retirement, if you don't have to pay for a doctor, that's a little bit more attractive. And those things tend to be appealing, Gerry. I think they're just a little bit more relaxed here in Canada. And then healthcare when you're in retirement age is a big factor as well.
And are they moving I know you're based in Toronto here, but are they moving to the major Toronto areas? Or are they going to some of the suburbs where our producer lives down by the river, down by the other side of town?
I think most of them are moving places outside of the core of the city, Gerry.
Well, I know we're going to have you on the podcast, and like I say, in the next 5 weeks, we're going to have Karlene back on the show here. But we really appreciate your wisdom, and congrats again on your master's in taxation. And as you said, you have a 14-year-old daughter, and your son's in university. So I know you're very busy being a mother to some intelligent kids growing up here. So thank you for taking the time to being on the Snowbirds Expat Radio podcast. We look forward to seeing you over the next 5 or 6 weeks. And can we let the cat out of the bag? Can you tell me what the next topic is going to be?
Actually, I don't know just yet. Let's keep it as a surprise, Gerry. Let's keep it as a surprise.
Well, that's it. You got now I'm going to be bugging you for the next 5 or 6 weeks. What is it going to be on? It's hard to me.
Yeah, but thanks so much for having me, Gerry. I appreciate that. It's always a pleasure.
And how do people get a hold of you? I know we put together a great package that with your new website, you're going to be able to access Karlene on through this episode. But what's the easiest way in the next couple of weeks for people to get a hold of you?
Well, the easiest way would be to go to our website, which is www.brij.tax.
Okay, I people will get that. And you can always reach out to us as well, too, because one of my colleagues, Carson, who does a lot of work with Karlene here, you can also reach out to Carson Hamill as well, and he'll be able to direct you as well. But thanks again. We appreciate everybody watching the podcast. If you like it, follow it, subscribe, pass it on to friends, because this is a very, very volatile time these days between these two countries. We love the American people. We're close to them. But there's a lot of confusion out there, so feel free to reach out to us. So thank you once again. Thank you again for listening to the Snowbird Expat Radio Podcast. The best way you can support the podcast is to forward the episode to a friend, and please don't hesitate to like, subscribe, or leave a comment. Now, before you go, let me leave you with one of my favorite quotes. Be kind to all, the world is small.